Welcome to the channel. Here we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon Allport, a powerful examination of how prejudice forms, how it spreads, and how it shapes the way we see others.
Imagine you're running a hotel. Just picture it for a second. It's a nice, quiet resort, somewhere picturesque, maybe up in the mountains or right on a lake,
Right, like a really idyllic summer spot.
Exactly. And it's the early summer season, the weather is finally turning, and you go to check the morning mail. And you receive 2 letters.
Okay.
They're mailed at the exact same time from the exact same city, asking for room reservations for the exact same dates.
So completely identical requests.
Completely identical in tone, identical in their polite request for accommodations. But, and here's the catch, one is signed with the name Mr. Lockwood. The other is signed Mr. Greenberg. So the question I want to pose to you, listening right now, is this.
Yeah.
Does the name at the bottom of that page change your response?
I mean, logically, it seems like it should be the most straightforward administrative task in the world, right? It's binary. You either have a room available or you don't.
Right, it's just inventory.
Exactly. But the implications of that, yes or no, and, who gets which answer, reveal something incredibly profound and, frankly, deeply unsettling about human nature.
Yeah, because, and I should clarify, this isn't just some hypothetical thought experiment I made up to start the conversation.
No.
This was a real documented study.
Oh, yeah, the Canadian hotel experiment.
Yes,
Right.
conducted by a social scientist, S.L. Wax, who sent these exact letters to about 100 different resorts. And the results are just, they're staggering when you really look at them.
They really are.
So, to the letter from Mr. Lockwood, 95% of the resorts replied, and 93% offered him accommodations. They basically rolled out the red carpet.
Almost universal acceptance.
Yeah. But to Mr. Greenberg, only 52% even bothered to write back.
Wow.
And a mere 36% offered him a room.
That drop-off is massive. You go from nearly universal acceptance to profound rejection based entirely on a few ink strokes forming a surname. It perfectly captures a glaring statistical reality about how the human mind categorizes and ultimately rejects.
So today we are going deep into the murky, uncomfortable, and utterly fascinating waters of the human mind.
We really are. We're pulling insights from a foundational, monumental text in social psychology, Gordon W. Allport's The Nature of Prejudice.
Right. And this research was originally published way back in 1954, but as you're about to hear, it is shockingly, almost uncomfortably relevant to the world you are navigating today.
Absolutely. And our mission for this deep dive is to completely deconstruct the actual cognitive machinery of prejudice.
The nuts and bolts of it.
Exactly. We aren't just going to look at the history of it or the sociology, We want to explore why the human brain is biologically and psychologically wired to prejudge in the first place.
Because it is wired that way.
It is, and we'll examine how being a victim of prejudice physically and psychologically alters behavior.
And perhaps most surprisingly, we'll uncover why our own senses, our literal sight and smell, will actually lie to us.
Oh, the sensory stuff is wild.
Yeah, it really is. Like, our senses will lie just to confirm our pre-existing biases.
Oh.
But before we can dismantle prejudice, we really need to isolate exactly what it is.
Because it's a word we throw around constantly in everyday conversation.
Yeah.
Right. But defining it is surprisingly slippery.
So let's go back to that Canadian hotel experiment for a second. Mr. Lockwood gets the room. Mr. Greenberg gets the cold shoulder. What is actually happening in the cognitive processes of those hotel managers?
What's so illuminating about that specific experiment is that it perfectly isolates the 2 essential ingredients of ethnic prejudice.
Okay, where are they?
The first ingredient is definite hostility and rejection. Over 60% of those hotels wanted absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Greenberg.
Right. And the second ingredient?
The second, and this is the crucial one, is that the basis of the rejection was entirely categorical.
Meaning they didn't know a single solitary fact about Mr. Greenberg, the human being.
Precisely. They didn't run a background check. They didn't ask for references, For all they knew, Mr. Greenberg was a quiet, orderly, generous gentleman, and Mr. Lockwood was rowdy, entitled, and prone to destroying hotel property.
Like a total nightmare guest.
Exactly. The decision wasn't made on the merits of the individual. Mr. Greenberg was condemned solely on the basis of his presumed group membership. It was a categorical rejection.
I want to look at where this concept even comes from, actually, because the evolution of the word prejudice itself tells a story.
It really does.
Yeah, it originates from the ancient Latin noun Prejudicium.
Right, and in ancient Rome, prejudicium wasn't a dirty word. It simply meant a precedent.
Like in a legal sense.
Yeah, it was a neutral, legalistic term for a judgment based on previous decisions and experiences. If a court ruled a certain way on a property dispute, that was prejudicium for the next property dispute.
Just standard legal precedent. But then, as the term evolved into English, it started to shift, right? It acquired the meaning of a judgment formed before due examination and consideration of the facts.
A premature or hasty judgment, basically.
But even a hasty judgment isn't necessarily a toxic prejudice.
No, not at all. You can make a hasty judgment that it's going to rain because you see a dark cloud, and if it doesn't rain, you just admit you were wrong.
Oops, my bad.
Right. The final stage in the word's transformation is what matters for our deep dive today. It acquired its present emotional flavor, that intense feeling of favorableness or unfavorableness that accompanies a prior, unsupported judgment.
So we arrive at this incredibly tight, synthesized definition for negative ethnic prejudice. It is an antipathy based upon a faulty and inflexible generalization.
Faulty and inflexible, those are definitely the load-bearing words in that definition.
They absolutely are. It may be felt internally or expressed externally. Right?
Yeah, and it may be directed toward a group as a whole or toward an individual just because they belong to that group.
But the defining characteristic is that inflexibility, the absolute refusal to update the judgment when presented with new information.
And this leads to a distinction that I think is going to change how a lot of people argue.
Oh, for sure.
There is a massive psychological difference between an attitude of disfavor and the belief that rationalizes it. We usually think of these as the exact same thing.
Right, like if I believe someone is dangerous, my attitude is fear.
Exactly, but they are entirely different beasts. It explains a phenomenon we've all experienced, why you can almost never argue someone out of a prejudice using facts.
Yes. It's so frustrating.
There's a brilliant dialogue used to illustrate this in the source, a hypothetical conversation between Mr. X and Mr. Y.
Let's actually play this out because it perfectly captures the dynamic. So Mr. X is the prejudiced individual. He says, the trouble with the Jews is that they only take care of their own group.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Y is the rationalist. He brings actual data to the table. He says, but the record of the community chess campaign shows that they give more generously in proportion to their numbers to the general charities of the community than do non-Jews.
Now, stop right there. A truly rational person, someone who had simply made a hasty judgment, would look at that new factual evidence and say, oh, I was misinformed, my underlying premise was wrong, and they would adjust their attitude.
Right.
But how does Mr. X respond?
Mr. X instantly pivots. Without missing a beat, he says, that just shows they're always trying to buy favor and intrude into Christian affairs. They think of nothing but money. That is why there are so many Jewish bankers.
And there it is. The attitude, the underlying hostility and rejection remains completely fixed.
Unmoved.
But the belief, the rationalization he uses to justify the hostility is incredibly slippery. When one belief is rationally attacked and destroyed by data, the prejudiced mind doesn't surrender.
It just accommodates itself by generating a brand new negative belief to prop up the original attitude.
Exactly.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Is prejudice essentially like a really stubborn operating system on a computer?
Oh, I like that.
And the beliefs are just interchangeable apps. You delete one rationalization because it's proven buggy or false, and the brain just immediately downloads another app to keep the underlying operating system running smoothly.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Mm-hmm. The operating system refuses to shut down. And the crucial question is why? Why hold on to a broken operating system?
Right. What's the benefit?
And the answer lies in what social psychologists call functional significance.
Meaning it serves a very specific practical purpose for the person holding it.
Exactly. If a negative attitude was truly just a random error in thinking, it wouldn't be defended so fiercely.
Because it wouldn't matter that much.
Right. But prejudice is almost always fashioned and sustained by self-gratifying considerations. It serves a private, often unconscious function for its bearer's ego.
Give me an example of what that functional significance looks like in the real world.
Okay, let's say someone is experiencing profound economic failure. They've lost their job, they can't pay their mortgage, and their ego is completely battered.
They're in a really vulnerable spot.
Exactly. It is incredibly painful to look inward and say, I failed because I lack the skills or I made bad choices.
No one wants to admit that.
It is much easier and vastly more comforting to the ego to look outward and say, I failed because that group is stealing our jobs. The prejudice functions as a scapegoat. It protects their fragile self-esteem. Or it might boost an insecure ego simply by allowing them to look down on someone else.
So if you come at them with economic data showing that the marginalized group isn't actually taking their jobs, you aren't just challenging a statistic. You are threatening their only psychological defense mechanism.
Precisely. If logic is the weapon you bring to fight prejudice, you're bringing the wrong weapon to the battlefield.
Wow.
Prejudice isn't built on logic. It's built on deep psychological need.
Which raises an incredibly uncomfortable question. If prejudice is this stubborn, irrational operating system that actively fights off facts, why on earth did human beings evolve to do this in the first place?
It seems like a massive cognitive flaw, doesn't it?
It really does.
But it seems like a flaw until you realize that the propensity for prejudice is actually rooted in normal, everyday, essential human cognitive processes.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It stems directly from our absolute biological necessity to form categories.
Oh, because life is simply too short, right?
Yeah.
The demands of practical adjustments are too great for us to examine every single object, event, or person individually. We need rubrics to survive.
Think about walking into a grocery store.
Okay.
You don't pick up every single piece of fruit and run a chemical analysis to determine if it's safe to eat.
Right. Nobody has time for that.
You rely on the category apple. You've interacted with apples before. You know they are generally safe, sweet, and crunchy. You categorize to save time and mental energy. We do this with food, with animals, with furniture, with dangerous situations.
And we deal with people.
We have to. It is the brain's principle of least effort. It takes a tremendous amount of mental and emotional energy to evaluate every new person you meet on their own unique merits.
Right. To listen to their whole life story, to judge their individual character.
Exactly. It is vastly more efficient for a tired, busy human brain to assign them to a category and assume they share the presumed traits of that category.
There's an incredibly relatable, almost charming anecdote in the research about a young boy that illustrates how naturally this happens.
Well, the Norwegian saga.
Yeah. So this boy reads a Norse saga, and he's absolutely captivated by the gigantic stature of this mythical character named Ymir.
Right.
From this one story, he develops this rigid idea that all Norwegians are massive, terrifying giants. For years, he walks around his town, low-key terrified that he's going to turn a corner and run into a giant Norwegian.
It's a perfect encapsulation of how our brains work when we are young or when we are operating on limited information. It's a faulty generalization.
Yeah.
He took a thimble full of facts, one character in a book, and made a generalization as large as a tub.
But I want to be very clear here, because there is a massive difference between the boy's simple misconception and an actual toxic prejudice.
Yeah.
What happens when this boy finally meets some real people from that part of the world?
Well, the boy eventually met 3 Englishmen. He observed their average height, their normal attributes, and later, when he learned what Norwegians actually look like, he realized his mistake.
You just updated the file.
Exactly. He was capable of rectifying his erroneous judgment in the light of new evidence. A misconception is essentially just organizing wrong information, but it is not emotionally resistant to change.
But a prejudice is emotionally resistant.
Yes. A prejudgment only becomes a prejudice if it is entirely irreversible when exposed to new knowledge.
So if he met normal-sized Norwegians and still insisted they were all giants...
Then it's a prejudice. A person who is merely misinformed will update their category. A prejudiced person will become highly emotional, defensive, and hostile when their category is threatened with contradiction.
And when that contradiction happens, the brain does something fascinating. There's a psychological defense mechanism called refencing. I think once you hear this, you will recognize it everywhere. Let's say a highly prejudiced person, someone who holds deep anti-minority views, is forced to interact with a family from that minority group.
Okay.
And this family completely shatters their stereotype. They are highly educated, deeply moral, incredibly kind community leaders. The prejudiced person can't deny the reality in front of them. So what do? Do they discard their hateful category?
No, they create an exception.
Wow.
They don't want to dismantle the mental fence that protects their worldview. So when a fact absolutely cannot fit into their mental field, they acknowledge the exception, but they hastily build a new fence around it.
Just cordoning them off.
Exactly. This allows the negative rubric to remain intact and dangerous for everyone else.
It's the classic disarming device. We hear it all the time. Oh, well, some of my best friends are, and you fill in the blank.
That's refencing right there.
By acknowledging an exception, you mentally separate those specific individuals from the real members of the group. Sure, the Smiths are great, but they aren't like the rest of them. Your prejudice survives untouched.
It's a brilliant, if insidious, cognitive trick. It allows you to maintain the principle of least effort while technically acknowledging reality, but only just enough to neutralize the threat to your ego.
Wait, let me challenge this a bit.
Sure.
Are you saying our brain's desire for efficiency, this biological need to save mental energy, is actually the biological root of bigotry? Like, are humans basically just doomed to prejudice because we're intellectually lazy?
Intellectually lazy is a bit loaded. It puts a moral judgment on a biological necessity. It's more accurate to say our brains are optimized for quick processing, not necessarily accurate processing.
Right.
Quick processing kept our ancestors alive when making snap judgments about predators. But applied to complex modern sociology, it's a disaster. And there is a fascinating psychological framework that helps explain exactly how this flawed processing happens.
Let's hear it.
It's the difference between directed thinking and autistic thinking.
Now, I need to jump in here and give some crucial context for anyone listening. When we use the term autistic in this specific context, we are talking about mid-century psychoanalytic terminology.
Yes, absolutely.
We are absolutely not talking about the modern neurological diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder.
Correct. That's a vital distinction. In the psychological framework of the mid-20th century, directed thinking is problem-solving oriented toward reality.
Okay.
If you are trying to fix a broken car engine or solve a calculus equation or balance a checkbook, you are using directed thinking. It is objective, it relies on facts and observable reality.
So what is the older definition of autistic thinking?
It refers to entirely subjective, self-directed, fantasy-driven thought.
Oh, I see.
It's like daydreaming or wishful thinking, where your private obsessions, your fears, or your emotional needs completely color how you perceive a situation. It's when the ego takes the wheel and ignores the road. Prejudiced thinking leans heavily, almost exclusively, into this self-serving, fantasy-driven mode.
And there's a brilliant study that proves just how powerful this fantasy-driven thinking is when it comes to prejudice. It's the Cell's study on syllogisms.
Right. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what a syllogism is. It's a formal, logical argument where a conclusion is drawn from two premises.
Right, like the classic example, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Exactly. If the premises are true, the conclusion must logically be true.
It's pure directed thinking, math with words.
Right.
But the researcher, Cells, created syllogisms about minority groups, and crucially, he designed them so the logic was technically false.
This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah. For example, he gave students this prompt. If many Negroes are famous athletes, and if many famous athletes are national heroes, then many Negroes are national heroes.
Now, let's look at that with directed thinking. Logically, that conclusion does not necessarily follow the premises. Just because Group A overlaps with Group B and Group B overlaps with Group C, it doesn't guarantee Group A overlaps with Group C. It's an invalid syllogism.
But when Cells asked the college students to judge if the syllogisms were valid or invalid, a massive majority of the students who didn't actively check their own biases rated the false syllogisms as logically valid.
Yep.
Why? Simply because they personally agreed with the premise or the conclusion. Their private attitudes completely crushed the objective reality of the logic.
This is autistic or fantasy-driven thinking in action. Their thinking squashed reality to fit a preconceived narrative. They felt a certain way, so they bent the rules of logic to validate their feeling.
It's wild how the brain does that.
It demonstrates how deeply our drive to categorize, when combined with our emotional needs, can entirely short-circuit our rational faculties.
So, we've established that our brains are essentially built to categorize to save energy, and that we will bend logic to defend those categories if our ego depends on them.
Right.
But this drive to categorize doesn't just happen to other people. It starts much closer to home. It starts with how we categorize ourselves.
Which is the foundation of everything we're discussing. You cannot understand prejudice without understanding the mechanics of us versus them.
The in-groups and out-groups.
Exactly, the formation of in-groups and out-groups.
The research defines an in-group very simply, but the implications are massive. It says an in-group is any cluster of people who can use the term we with the same essential significance.
We. It's the most powerful word in human sociology.
Yeah.
Your family is your primary in-group. Then it expands: your neighborhood, your school, your hometown, your religion, your nation. What's fascinating is how shifting and arbitrary these groups can be.
Right, they change over time.
Centuries ago, loyalties to Scottish clans were fierce, absolute, and defined a person's entire existence. People killed and died for their clan. Today, for the most part, that specific in-group dynamic has faded into history or heritage. But the need for an in-group hasn't. In its place, we've seen the rise of incredibly dangerous modern fictions, like the concept of a biological master race acting as the ultimate violent in-group.
And there is a profound, almost counterintuitive argument made here about the sequence of these feelings. We tend to think that prejudice starts with hate.
Naturally.
But the research argues that hate prejudice is almost always a secondary development to what is called love prejudice.
Love prejudice. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it's deeply accurate. It basically means we naturally, biologically prefer the familiar.
It makes sense.
We seek the comfort of our own language, our own social class, our own customs.
Think about it. It takes less effort. There's that principle of least effort again, to exist around people who instantly get your jokes, who eat the same food you do, who share your basic presuppositions about how the world works.
You don't have to explain yourself.
Exactly.
Right. Patriotism, family loyalty, local pride, these come first. They are biologically and socially necessary for a species that relies on cooperation to survive. A baby must prefer its mother to a stranger. A tribe must prioritize its own members to ensure they don't starve.
But the trouble begins when we feel that our positive values, our beloved in-group, are threatened by an out-group.
Exactly. When the familiar is perceived to be in danger, that natural protective self-love curdles into out-group rejection and hostility.
There's a great historical example of this. In the 19th century, European cultural critics used to look across the Atlantic and sneer at Americans.
Oh, yes.
They wrote these scathing articles calling Americans scamps and vagabonds, treating the entire United States with total, unvarnished contempt.
Now, what was actually at the root of that contempt? Was it really an objective evaluation of American character?
Obviously not.
No. It was about European self-love. It was a pride of ancestry, a pride of entrenched culture. These European critics sensed a vague, looming threat to their own cultural dominance from this noisy, rapidly expanding, unrefined new nation.
So they get defensive.
So by disparaging America, they elevated themselves. They made their own in-group feel more secure. Their initial love of their own culture necessitated a secondary hate for the encroaching outsider.
But let me pose a thought experiment for you and for anyone listening.
Okay, let's do it.
Think about your own life. Can an in-group even exist without an out-group? If you look at a family as an in-group, by definition, all the other families on your street are out-groups.
Sure.
But you don't necessarily hate the family next door. You might loan them a lawnmower.
Yeah.
You just rub along in peace. But the moment there is a threat, say, a developer wants to bulldoze the neighborhood, suddenly the whole street becomes an in-group against the developer. Is a shared enemy a fundamental requirement for mass human cohesion?
You are hitting on one of the great debates in psychology and sociology. William James, the pioneering psychologist, actually believed that social cohesiveness does seem to require a common enemy.
Really?
Yeah, he was so convinced of this flaw in human nature that he famously wrote an essay looking for a moral equivalent for war.
A moral equivalent for war.
He thought humanity needed a shared struggle, maybe against nature or disease, because without an enemy, we would just fragment and fight each other.
But we aren't necessarily doomed to that, are we?
No, and this is where the nuance is vital. While a certain amount of predilection for one's own group is inevitable, you will always feel a tighter bond with your own child than a stranger's child. Hostility toward the outgroup is not biologically required.
Okay, that's reassuring.
The fatal psychological error occurs in the cognitive leap from they are different to they are a menace. You can observe a different culture, recognize it as not your own, and appreciate it without feeling your own culture is actively threatened.
But unfortunately for many people, that leap is made. And once that leap is made, something terrifying happens. If this hostility toward outsiders becomes a primary way a person navigates the world, it stops being just about one specific outgroup. It metastasizes.
Right. It stops being a singular belief and becomes an entire worldview.
Which brings us to the data on the ripple effect of prejudice. There is a striking statistical finding here. Prejudice is almost never isolated. Studies show a very strong statistical correlation, somewhere between positive 0.49 and positive 0.74 between anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Negro attitudes.
Which is a huge correlation.
Basically, if the data shows that someone hates one marginalized group, it heavily suggests they're going to hate several others.
And what this means for our understanding of society is monumental. It completely reframes the conversation. It suggests that prejudice is basically a trait of personality.
A personality trait,
Yeah.
not just an opinion.
Exactly. When it takes root in a person's life, it grows like a single unified organism. The specific object of the prejudice, whether it's a religious minority, a racial group, or an immigrant population, is almost immaterial.
It doesn't even matter who the target is.
No, it's not just a rational reaction to a specific ethnic group's behavior or history, as the prejudiced person will claim. It's a fundamental defect in how that person interacts with reality.
Let's use an analogy to make this concrete for the listener. It's not that someone goes to a massive buffet, tastes a specific dish, say a specific culture or religion evaluates it, and decides they just don't like the flavor of that one dish.
Okay.
It's that their taste buds are fundamentally broken. Literally everything outside their own immediate familiar diet tastes like poison to them.
That's a very apt way to describe it. The hostility and fear are systematic. It's a generalized dislike of all minorities, an overarching ethnocentrism. This type of personality is constantly on guard.
They must be exhausted.
They are constantly dichotomizing the world into a rigid, unforgiving us and them. The world is a threatening place, and prejudice is their armor.
But hold on. If it's just a broken personality trait, how do we explain the exceptions? Because I'm sure you and I both know people who might hold a very specific prejudice against one group, maybe based on a bad personal experience, but they seem perfectly tolerant, even progressive, regarding other marginalized groups.
And that is exactly the nuance we have to introduce. In statistics, this is called imperfect correlations. While a correlation of positive 0.74 is remarkably high in the social sciences, it is not positive 1.00.
That's not a perfect overlap?
It is not a perfect one-to-one overlap.
Right. The data explicitly shows there are people who are anti-Semitic, but not anti-Negro, or vice versa.
Therefore, we cannot blame personality structure entirely. We can't just throw up our hands and say, well, some people just have a prejudiced personality type, nothing we can do.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge that historical, cultural, and situational factors are vital pieces of the puzzle.
What does a situational factor look like in this context?
Look at local traditions or economic shifts. If you grow up in a community where one specific immigrant group has historically been the scapegoat for the town's economic woes, you might absorb that specific prejudice through sheer cultural osmosis.
Just by being there.
You might not have a generalized hateful personality, you just inherited a very specific localized blind spot. Or consider direct economic competition. If two distinct ethnic groups are suddenly competing for the exact same limited factory jobs in a struggling town, tension and prejudice will rise specifically between those two groups, driven purely by the situation.
That makes sense. Plural causation is key. But when a person is heavily prejudiced against multiple groups, or even just fiercely prejudiced against one, they almost never admit it's a flaw in their own personality or a product of their environment.
Oh, never. That would require directed thinking and ego deflation. They always blame the targets. It's not me, it's them.
Which brings us perfectly to the thorniest defense mechanism of all. The prejudiced person's absolute favorite shield, the well-deserved reputation theory.
Yes. You ask someone why they harbor these intense negative attitudes toward a group, and they will confidently look you in the eye and say, just look at them. I'm not prejudiced. I'm just observant.
Right. I'm just telling it like it is.
Their unpopularity rests on a well-deserved reputation for being lazy or greedy or dangerous.
It's the ultimate rationalization because it shifts the entire moral burden onto the victim. They argue that the outgroup inherently possesses offensive traits that practically beg for rejection. So how does the science dismantle this?
We have to methodically dismantle this using a rigorous framework. We have to ask the foundational question. Even if real differences exist between groups, which culturally they obviously do those differences, logically justify categorical hostility and rejection.
There's a brilliant, simple analogy used here. Look at a normal family. You might have one sibling, Ted, who is incredibly bright, handsome, extroverted, and successful.
Okay, lucky Ted.
And his brother, Jim, is a bit dull, socially awkward, and homely. And their sister, Deborah, is just peculiar. She has eccentric hobbies, and weird opinions.
Yet these oddly assorted siblings may accept their vast differences and love one another deeply. They don't reject Jim because he's awkward. Difference alone does not mandate hostility.
Right.
But the prejudiced person always claims that the alleged difference is the singular cause of his attitude.
Let's talk about the actual science of these alleged differences, because prejudice theories almost always eventually rely on the idea of innate biological inferiority. They say it's in their genetics.
Oh, they love to lean on pseudogenetics.
There is a fascinating study referenced the Yale Developmental Schedule study on newborn infants that completely shatters this.
This is a crucial piece of evidence. Researchers wanted to look at infants to try to rule out the impacts of environment, education, and cultural suppression as much as humanly possible. If a group is biologically inferior, it should show up from day one.
So they examined 100 black infants in New Haven and compared their development with an equal number of white infants. And the results. The average New Haven black infant was actually slightly ahead in behavioral and gross motor development compared to the average white infant.
There was absolutely zero evidence of innate biological inferiority. The playing field at birth was not just level, it's slightly favored the minority group in this specific metric.
Wow.
Yet look at society decades later. We know that environmental, economic, and cultural forces shape incredibly divergent, often tragic outcomes. The reputation a marginalized group gets is almost entirely the result of systemic barriers placed upon them by the majority.
It's a rigged game.
And then, the prejudiced majority uses the result of those barriers as proof that the barriers were justified in the first place.
It's maddening. So to help us actually categorize how groups differ in reality without falling into the trap of prejudice, we need to understand 4 statistical realities of group differences.
Yes, this is important.
If we are going to look at facts, let's look at how facts actually distribute across populations. The first is the J-curve of conformity.
This curve describes high probability traits based on strict cultural or institutional rules. It looks like a J on a graph because almost everyone does it.
Okay, give me an example.
For example, if you look at devout Catholics, there is a massive J-curve of conformity regarding attending Mass on Sunday. The vast majority conform to this behavior. Or consider American motorists stopping at a red traffic light. It's a culturally enforced conformity. It is a real group difference. Catholics attend Mass more than non-Catholics, but it's institutional, not biological.
Right. Now, the second one is where the prejudiced mind really fails, overlapping normal curves.
This is where almost all human traits fall. Think of a bell curve. Now think of 2 bell curves layered on top of each other. Let's use physical height between men and women as a non-controversial example.
Okay, so the statistical average man is taller than the statistical average woman.
Correct. The peak of the men's bell curve is further to the right than the women's, but the curves overlap immensely.
Meaning, millions of individual women in the lower average group will still be significantly taller than millions of individual men in the higher average group.
So if you make a categorical statement like men are tall and women are short, you are mathematically absurd because you are ignoring the massive overlapping reality of millions of people.
Exactly. When prejudiced people claim a group is less intelligent or more aggressive, even if there were a fractional difference in the statistical mean, which is highly debatable and usually environmentally driven, the immense overlap of the curves makes sweeping categorical judgments logically bankrupt.
And the final 2 are the rare zero and categorical differentials.
Categorical differences are absolute. Every single member of a group has it, and absolutely no one outside the group has it. It's exceedingly rare in human sociology.
What's an example?
It mostly applies to strict biological definitions like albinism or fundamental anatomical gender distinctions. So, if the scientific reality shows immense overlap between human groups, and if the concept of race itself is biologically flimsy, endless cross-mating and migration throughout human history has diluted human stocks to the point where biological race is largely a social construct. Why does the illusion of stark categorical difference persist so strongly in the prejudiced mind?
Because if the objective science doesn't support the prejudice, the human mind must manufacture the support. It has to. And it does this through literally hijacking human perception.
This brings us to a concept that absolutely blew my mind, the idea of visual cues acting as condensing rods.
It's a powerful metaphor. Think of a lightning rod on a house. It draws all the chaotic electricity in the air to a single focus point. In human interaction, highly visible physical traits like skin color or specific facial features or even traditional clothing act as condensing rods for our attitudes.
It focuses all the generalized anxiety and hostility onto one visible target. But it goes further than just focusing hate. It literally blinds the person. The research notes a terrifying phenomenon. People who have a high anti-Negro bias often completely fail to recognize the faces of individual Black people they have interacted with.
It's unbelievable.
They literally do not perceive their individuality. They look at a human face and just see the category. The condensing rod of skin color entirely blinds them to the human being.
Because if they truly acknowledge the individuality, if they see a unique person with a unique face and a unique soul, the categorical prejudice is threatened. The principle of least effort is disrupted. But the mind goes even further than visual blindness. It dives into a bizarre territory called sensory aversion.
Oh, this is where it gets strange and, frankly, disturbing.
Yeah.
Prejudiced people often develop instinctive, almost zoological explanations for their hatred.
Zoological, yes.
They will claim an outgroup has different blood, or they will swear that a minority group has repugnant, distinct body odor. They claim they can literally smell the difference.
It's a desperate attempt to anchor a social prejudice in raw biology. It's not my fault I hate them. It's not a moral failure. My body instinctively, physically recoils from their smell. It provides a ready, physical, undeniable rationalization for an unfounded belief.
But science tested this. I am so eager to share this specific experiment because it is so definitive. It's the G.K. Moreland sweat experiment.
Yes, this is a classic. Moreland wanted to test if this sensory aversion was real biology or hallucinated prejudice, so he asked 50 judges to differentiate the body odor of white and Black male college students.
And to make sure it was a fair, robust test of actual human sweat, all the students had just been put through 15 minutes of vigorous, intense exercise. They were sweating profusely.
Right.
They collected the sweat, and the identities and races of the students were completely disguised from the judges. So you have 50 judges sniffing the sweat of different races, trying to confidently categorize them into us and the them.
And the results. The judges utterly, completely failed.
Failed. Their incorrect identifications actually exceeded pure chance.
Meaning what?
Meaning, if they had just flipped a coin, heads it's white, tails it's black, they would have been more statistically accurate than relying on their supposedly infallible sensory aversion.
The profound implication here is that prejudice literally alters human perception. It rewrites your sensory reality.
It is entirely backwards to how we intuitively think it works. We assume someone smells a distinct difference, is repulsed by it, and then becomes prejudiced.
Right, that's the logic people claim.
But the science says no, we become prejudiced first for psychological reasons, and our brain actually hallucinates a sensory difference to justify our attitude.
It is a terrifying testament to the power of autistic, fantasy-driven thinking. The emotional need to justify the prejudice is so overwhelming that the brain will forge sensory data. It will make you see things that aren't there and smell things that don't exist.
Let me throw a wild thought experiment at you. Imagine if tomorrow a bizarre virus swept the globe.
Yeah.
And we all suddenly went completely colorblind. We couldn't see skin tone. And simultaneously, we lost our sense of smell. According to everything we've discussed about how the brain works, would prejudice disappear?
Based on the functional significance of prejudice, no, it absolutely would not disappear.
We would just start discriminating based on the pitch of someone's voice or the texture of their hair or whether their earlobes are attached or detached.
Exactly, because the underlying reality is that the need to discriminate predates the excuse to discriminate.
Wow.
The operating system needs an output. If the primary visual cues, the old condensing rods, disappear, the prejudiced operating system will simply scan the environment for new condensing rods to attach its hostility to. The internal hardware remains unbroken. It just looks for a new target.
But here is the tragedy of it all. Prejudice doesn't just damage the perpetrator's worldview, distorting their logic and literally hijacking their senses. It exerts a terrifying gravitational pull on the targets themselves. We have to talk about the victims.
This is undoubtedly one of the most sobering aspects of social psychology, because it forces us to look at how constant, systemic, inescapable discrimination forces ego defenses upon the victim. You cannot subject a group of human beings to categorical rejection generation after generation without it leaving profound psychological scars.
The research lists these as traits due to victimization. And they aren't inherent traits, they're desperate survival mechanisms. One of the primary ones we see emerge historically is clowning or slyness and cunning.
And we have to deeply understand why these emerge. We can't judge them from a place of privilege. There is a fascinating, if depressing, double standard of ethics in human history.
What do you mean?
Primitive tribes and civilized nations alike apply entirely different moral standards to their in-group versus an out-group. You are expected to deal fairly, honestly, and transparently with your in-group, but it is often considered acceptable, even praiseworthy or clever, to cheat, deceive, or exploit an outsider.
Right. So put yourself in the shoes of a persecuted minority group. Your very physical and economic survival depends on navigating a majority that is actively, sometimes violently hostile to you. The game is rigged. The laws don't protect you. In that scenario, deceit becomes a completely logical, protective response.
Exactly. If you cannot win through direct, honest competition because the system is designed to crush you, slyness and cunning are the only tools left in the toolbox. You pretend to agree with the oppressor, you hide your true feelings, you mask your intentions, you manipulate the rules from the shadows. It is an ego defense, and it is a physical survival strategy.
And clowning functions similarly. If the dominant, powerful group expects you to be inferior, simple-minded, or foolish, sometimes playing the fool is the safest way to disarm their hostility.
It's a mask.
If you make them laugh or if you make them feel superior, they are less likely to perceive you as a threat and attack you. But the cost to the victim's internal self-esteem is immense.
Which leads to what is arguably the darkest manifestation of this psychological toll: self-hate and identification with the dominant group.
There are incredibly dark, horrific instances of this documented from Nazi concentration camps. It notes that some prisoners, after enduring extreme, unimaginable suffering, starvation, and having all normal methods of human ego defense completely stripped away, they began to imitate the guards.
It's hard to even comprehend. They scavenged scraps of the guards' clothing to wear. They adopted the guards' brutal vocabulary and their physical brutality toward other, weaker prisoners. They essentially internalized the dark mentality of their oppressor.
Why? How does the human mind fracture that completely?
It is a desperate attempt to keep some fragmented, distorted illusion of self-respect intact. If you are entirely powerless and you completely surrender your identity to the power of the oppressor, if you become them in your mind, you trick yourself into feeling a tiny sliver of their power.
That's heartbreaking.
It is the ultimate psychological breaking point. The sheer weight of the oppression destroys the integrity of the ego entirely, reverses normal human pride, and creates a groveling, self-loathing image.
And while the concentration camps are the most extreme historical example imaginable, we see this mechanism echo in lesser but still damaging everyday ways in modern society. We see it in colorism within minority communities.
Yes, the phenomenon where members of a marginalized group internalize the majority standard of beauty, leading to prejudice and hierarchy within the minority group based on lighter versus darker skin tones. Or you see an insecure member of a minority group joining the majority in aggressively condemning another marginalized outgroup, hoping that aligning with the dominant prejudice will buy them a ticket into the protected in-group.
But the research also notes it can go the other way, right? Victimization doesn't exclusively produce self-hate or cunning.
No, it can also create immense, profound empathy. There's a moving account of a Jewish student who wrote about sympathizing deeply with the Black community in America because the student knew firsthand, through their own heritage in life, what it meant to be systematically discriminated against. That shared experience of victimization forged a powerful bond of solidarity. Empathy can be a defense mechanism, too, a way to find meaning, connection, and strength in the face of hostility.
But I want you, listening right now, to consider the deeply tragic paradox at the core of all this.
It really is a paradox.
The prejudiced majority creates oppressive, unfair, dangerous conditions for a minority group. Those very conditions literally force the minority group to develop defensive survival traits like cunning or secrecy or clannishness. And then the majority looks at those exact defensive traits and says, proof. That proves our initial prejudice was justified all along.
It is the ultimate tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. You lock a dog in a cage, you starve it, you poke it with a stick, and when it finally bares its teeth to defend itself, you step back and say, "See? I told you it was a vicious, dangerous animal." The prejudice generates the very evidence it uses to sustain itself.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of psychological ground today.
We really have.
We started with 2 simple letters to a hotel, Lockwood and Greenberg, to isolate what prejudice truly is, an inflexible, categorical rejection based on a presumed group.
We've seen how it isn't just a simple, easily corrected opinion, but a comprehensive, stubborn cognitive distortion. We traced its roots from the biologically normal, necessary mental shortcuts of categorization, our brain's desperate need to save energy through the principle of least effort.
We watched how natural, understandable love prejudice for our own familiar in-group can curdle into toxic hate for an out-group the moment we feel threatened. We discussed how prejudice often grows as a unified personality trait, basically breaking the taste buds of how a person interacts with the entire world.
We dismantled the well-deserved reputation myth by looking at the science of overlapping group differences, showing that statistical overlap makes categorical hate illogical. We uncovered the terrifying reality that the prejudiced mind will literally hallucinate sensory differences like the sweat experiment just to rationalize its hate.
And finally, we looked at the tragic psychological scars it leaves on the victimized. From survival cunning to heartbreaking self-hate, locking society in an endless, self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over as you go about your day, building on this exploration of our cognitive processes. We've discussed heavily how the principle of least effort and autistic thinking, the desire to avoid the friction and complexity of objective reality, fuel prejudice.
Right, our brains are fundamentally lazy and want the easy category.
So consider this in the context of your own life today. We live in an era where algorithms feed us customized, perfectly curated realities. Our technology, our social media feeds, our news aggregators literally does the categorizing for us to save us effort. It shows us only what we want to see, only what we already agree with, and only the people who think exactly like we do.
It is the ultimate least effort machine.
Exactly. Are we accidentally building the ultimate frictionless infrastructure for prejudice? If the cure for bias is directed thinking, actively grappling with contradictory evidence, experiencing the uncomfortable friction of nuance, and meeting individuals who break our preconceived molds, what happens to the human mind when our entire digital world is designed to be completely frictionless.
If the operating system is never challenged by an unexpected error, the prejudice never has to update. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And next time you make a snap judgment about someone, stop and ask yourself if you're looking at a Lockwood or a Greenberg.